Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. I am Britt Delo, Director of Membership with the West Coast Chamber, and we are so happy to have all of you here this morning. Over the past 8 weeks, the Chamber has pivoted to provide virtual programming that is meaningful to both you and your business. And as we continue to work towards reopening businesses in a restart, we'll be sure to continue providing tools and resources. So today we are so excited to welcome back Ryan Anderson, VP of Digital Innovation with Herman Miller. He has some great tips for us today on how to keep things on track while running projects remotely. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All callers have been placed on mute to help minimize noise. The chat feature will be running and active, so be sure to put in comments and questions as we go. Ryan has a prepared presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Ryan. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a beautiful day in West Michigan, and it's good to be back with this crowd. I'm really thankful. We got a chance to do a happy hour, a couple of weeks ago, focused on being on video. So it's good to be back on video with you, Britt, and the team. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about working remotely and running projects remotely. And it's something that I've done just personally for a lot of years. It's the way I like to work, to be honest, typically, although right now things are a little crazy. I'm not sure this is how any of us want to work in terms of being forced to work remotely, but just in terms of my own job, I run projects with people that are global. They're distributed all over, and we rarely get a chance to be in the same space, but it works and we enjoy it. And so I'm drawing from some of my own experience as well as quite a bit of research from Herman Miller in terms of sharing just some best practices. I mean, my hope is to be of help to everyone on the call today. Working remotely has its challenges. Some of you might feel like you're really experienced at it. Some of you might feel like, geez, this is brand new and it's maddening. And we'll try to work through some of the practical best tips, best practices that can make things better. If you advance to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of background, but here's my request. I'll give like maybe 3 or 4 minutes worth of background just in terms of Herman Miller and my history here. But while I do that, if any of you in the chat function feel comfortable telling me what are your challenges right now with remote working, I'll pause after these introduction slides, and then we'll take a look at what's in the chat box just to make sure that I cover off on the things that are most relevant to you. So feel free to do that for the next few minutes. Tell us what your biggest challenges are. As I mentioned in the way of background, Herman Miller's got a lot of history here. We started our technology exploration back in 1968, working with Stanford on basically demonstrating the first personal computer. When Stanford showed the world the first personal computer and something that is now known as the mother of all demos, Herman Miller created the environment for it. And it set kind of a precedent for us where we like to stay close to the smartest minds in technology so that we can understand the technology and we can accommodate new ways of working. If you go to the next slide, in recent years, that work has included a bunch of collaboration with Skype, Logitech. In fact, with Skype, we did like an 18-month deep dive in 2014 and 15 on working remotely. We've worked with Google, Samsung, just a whole bunch of folks. And usually the technology companies are interested in the spatial side of things, and we're interested in both. So I'll be drawing from that as we go through today. I'm going to have us go to the next slide, and I will introduce this principle, and then I'll pause to take a look at what you all put in the chat box. This is where I want to start, friends. If you're really established at doing something just in your normal day-to-day business activities, and you try to start doing that virtually, it's probably not typically going to immediately translate. You have to be intentional about the translation. And this is true of a whole host of things, like what we do in our personal lives, what we do at work, et cetera. If you suddenly start doing that virtually, it comes with its own challenges, which I'm sure you've experienced, whether that's hanging out with friends or dealing with coworkers or your boss or church activities or anything else. And so the principle here is that the normal processes don't automatically or directly translate into virtual processes. And if you don't stop and say, all right, I'm going to have to go through a process of figuring this out, then things can get disjointed real quickly. People can get frustrated. Critical time and energy is lost. And the fact is we're working under a degree of duress. And so the last thing any of us need is more stress. We want things to go smoothly. And so it starts with saying, all right, what is this translation process? I like to think about things from the end backwards, right? So it's the end of a successful project or a sales presentation, or it could be anything. It depends on what you do. Maybe you work at a nonprofit, maybe you work in supply chain management for a company. It could be anything, but try as best you can to figure out where is this meant to go, and then work backwards and say, okay, what do we have to do between now and then to get there? One of the most important things is role clarity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do think it takes someone, and it doesn't have to be the boss, someone to step up and say, I'm going to help figure this out. And that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. We have 11 chats. That's awesome. I'm just going to read through these a little bit. How to keep staff motivated. Yes, we are definitely going to talk about that. So I'm going to read through each of these, and then it's up to you to keep me accountable. I'm going to talk about all of these as we go through, but if I miss something, then when we start the Q&A time, and I'm going to leave at least a good 15 minutes for Q&A. If I miss any of this, then we're going to circle back to it. Lack of daily structure, amen. I just heard about somebody this morning who typically bikes to work, who has gotten on like an exercise bike for 10 minutes every morning before she starts working, just to try to keep that structure, which I found really interesting. Making sales goals, oh gosh, I get it, Robin. And not only is it a challenge of working virtually, but it's just the economy as well. We can talk about that. I might circle back to that at the end to get a little bit more specific on sales presentations. Getting everyone on the same page without resorting to constant video meetings and phone calls. Yes, that is one of the biggest challenges, particularly because of what is known as Zoom fatigue or video fatigue. Being present with one another, particularly if you've got video on, is very taxing cognitively. Like it really takes it out of you, particularly if you're an introvert. And so it is critical to stay on the same page, and we will talk about that. Communicating as a team from a distance, yes. Preventing details from falling through the cracks, absolutely. Missing opportunities to collaborate. We're definitely going to dive into that, and I'm going to get a little bit techie on you. Britt, you know I like to do that. Ways to determine accessibility and communication approaches for that. Oh, I love that, because the topic of inclusion and accessibility is one that's near and dear to my heart, and it does provide a different set of challenges for working remotely. And maybe, Mari, as we get into that, if there's specifics, whether it's just general accessibility for everyone, or if it's somebody with some accessibility concerns, maybe that's sensory, motor, other challenges that you want to talk about, we can do that too. Sense of purpose for team members that are working from home and have a limited workload, yes. General state of distraction and other business we'd like to work with. Oh, businesses we'd like to work with. Yes, you're right. Everybody is. I don't know that I can solve that one, but I can talk a little bit about how to try to focus in a way that is respectful of their time and hopefully works well for them. And a good project plan online tool. Okay, these are excellent. I think we're going to cover the majority of them, but seeing these does make me want to introduce a framework that I don't think I put into the deck, which is around team dynamics. So I'm gonna insert that at our next slide. Okay, it's up to you all, my friends, to hold me accountable, because we said this was a workshop, not just me droning on. So let's make sure we cover those, and if I don't, then you're gonna hold me accountable at the end. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about this. Where do we begin? Number one, champion your virtual team culture. Several of those questions were around team dynamics, making sure that you've got everybody connected, things aren't falling through the cracks. It also refers to not just your own team, but the people you're trying to interact with externally. As I mentioned, I didn't put this in the deck, but there's a very good framework that came out of Wharton School of Business that talks about shared identity and shared understanding as the two things that you might want to think about in terms of your team. So shared identity is, are we all in this together? Not just who are we as a team, but you know how there's sometimes subgroups and sometimes these little fault lines, these little fraction lines in terms of how people interact. It is really critical when we don't have the benefit of hanging out together, that everyone feels like we're all part of a cohesive whole. And if your organization's dealing with layoffs and things of that nature, there's probably tons of stress and concern and anxiety. Trying to have people feel like they're part of something, they're cared for, is really, really critical. And that's part of that identity, knowing, you know, that you have a shared sense of belonging and trust with others. Shared understanding is around communication, which is, I think, a better way of saying what it really means to effectively communicate. We can talk all day long. We can send emails. We can be on Zoom meetings. We can be, on audio meetings. Does everybody have an understanding of each other? Do you understand what's happening with the work? Do you understand what's happening in each other's lives? That's where shared understanding is really critical. And so we'll get into each of these in more depth in a minute. But I think the principle here is, if you've worked with the same people forever, and you've got this established set of relationships, and now you're doing things virtually, it might not be the same dynamic. You might find that it's just different, and it's a challenge, and that you need to be intentional about saying, we have a virtual culture that we're trying to establish here, and that each of us need to be attentive to it. The second thing is around tool sets. I mean, I have digital in my title, so I'm going to get a little bit techie on you here, and introduce you to an important framework for understanding the different types of collaboration tools, just so that you can think a little bit maybe more purposefully about what you're using. Some of you might have already done this, but I think it helps to review it. Designing professional video interactions for internal and external stakeholders. A few of you may have been on the webinar a couple of weeks ago where we talked about being on video, so I'm not going to get super in depth here, but video is crazy. I mean, even right now, I got to tell you, I'm trying to avoid looking at myself on the screen. And I can minimize it, I can focus it on the content, but it's a different animal than trying to work with each other in normal ways. And so it does take some getting used to, and there are some best practices there around making sure that it isn't an awkward experience. Most of us saw the BBC clip, right? That poor guy where his kids bust in the back of the room and chaos breaks loose. And so there's maybe a little bit of anxiety around things like having your dog barking and your kids come in, but it shouldn't. I mean, actually what the best research indicates is that a little bit of transparency and helping people understand your environment and what you're facing is actually really good for building empathy. But that doesn't mean that we want to show up in t-shirts in a bathing suit, drinking a beer to our next board meeting. And then managing process effectiveness. What does it look like to try to keep things on track? Those are the major points we'll talk about. I'm going to do another quick check-in on the chat bar because I see a few other questions. Online tools and processes to use when chaos is and workload is much higher than normal. Yes, we're going to talk about that. And how to communicate, reiterate that everything doesn't have to be a meeting. Oh my gosh, Darla, it's like you took a chapter out of my playbook. We're definitely going to talk about that because most of us are overscheduled right now. And when you're trying to do other things in life, like educate your kids or care for a pet or aging relative, it's tough. Awesome. Next slide, please. I'm going to take a quick sip of coffee. Okay, championing the team culture. As I mentioned, the leader doesn't need to be the boss. Let's just assume for the sake of our discussion today that every one of you is the leader. Deciding to be the glue. Making sure that the group has that shared sense of identity, that shared sense of understanding is really important. And frequent communication is the key. But communication is broad. I mean, it's listening to people. It's trying to get a pulse of what's going on. It's not just email updates all day long or scheduling meetings like we talked about. It's trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And some of that is around process. Some of that's just around our personal kind of state and how we're doing with wrestling through forced remote working during a global pandemic. So acknowledging the challenges and empowering everyone to figure things out is really important. In fact, I'm getting real specific here, but the more you can say we and describe the we situation not as a subgroup. So let's just say you're part of a broader team and you're on the management team or you're on the project management team. When you say we, make sure it's holistic. Like, what are we all facing? What can we all do? Who's got a suggestion for what it'll take to make us be more effective? Who sees things breaking down process-wise, and who can raise their hand and say, I'm not sure this is working quite right? Empower everyone, my friends, and I think you're going to find that people adapt much better. As I mentioned, be sensitive to personal duress. Social times are important. I know it's a little cliche to do like video happy hours or coffee or whatever, but think about some of your rituals and protocols as an organization. So as an example, do you have people celebrating work anniversaries? If so, that's a good reason to have a Zoom meeting. Have everybody get a cup of coffee and toast, Jane on her 25th anniversary or whatever, as opposed to just like those constant, weekly or daily update sort of meetings. Social times are really important. And anything you can do to try to have the team feel like they're that somebody has their back is really what I'm getting at, is really critical. All right, next slide, please. Tool set. I said I was going to introduce you to a framework around technology tools. This is it. I want to discuss the difference between synchronous collaboration tools and asynchronous collaboration tools. The terms just refer to how and when you use them. Synchronous tools you're using at the same time. So right now we're on RingCentral, which has, I think, a Zoom feature, FaceTime, the meeting function on Teams, WebEx, phone calls. Everyone does it together. And there's some value there. In particular with video, there's nonverbals, which is kind of nice. You know, if you're just getting to know somebody and you're a person that gestures a lot, it's nice to be able to see some of those nonverbals. But boy, is it demanding, right? I mean, being on video meetings or audio meetings all day is really, really tough. So like this week, I think it's AP tests for a lot of high school students. Yesterday, I was on a call and my 16-year-old came to the door of my office and was like, I need to take an AP test. Can I use the office? And I said, sure. So I buggered out of here and let her use it. But there's other stuff going on. And I happened to be with a group of people and I said, hey, I'm going to cut my video and I'm going to cut my phone call short because I want to be able to help her get ready for what she's doing. And that was cool. But I've heard of some people being on video like 6 hours a day. That is not sustainable, my friends. Cognitively, it's not sustainable, and it just prevents you from attending to all the other things in life, which is where asynchronous tools comes in. And yes, I am an evangelist. I am a proponent of asynchronous tools. Sorry about my dog barking, by the way. His name is Griffin. We have a lot of menacing Amazon delivery people in the neighborhood that he's protecting me from. Asynchronous tools allow people to work when they want to work. So you're still collaborating. You're still part of a process that's building and working together, but you're doing it on your own time. And I think the probably earliest example of this is what Google did with the Google Suite, right? So I remember hearing from a group of students at Georgia Tech years ago who were presenting at a conference about this project they did. This was like 10 years ago. And I asked them, tell me about your process. And they said, well, we got together in the student union. We decided what everyone should do. We created a Google Doc. And then we all worked on it, and we got together again like 8 weeks later to make sure that we were on track, and then we presented it to our professor. And I remember saying, you didn't see each other like at all? You're on the same college campus for 8 weeks. And they said, well, we got different schedules. We just kept working. And that was the first time I remember thinking, wow, what power in being able to work together. We've seen in other arenas as well. If you look at music, you know, the days of artists going into a studio with a bottle of Jack, they cut a new LP, that's long gone. People cut a piece in LA and somebody else is in Nashville, somebody's in London, the producer stitches it all together. It's totally asynchronous. Well, that's what we can do. We can leverage asynchronous collaboration tools to be, I think, faster, better, much more effective, much more rested. You're coming at the type of work you want to do when you feel most prepared to do it. I am a huge fan of Slack. I've used Slack for years. If you're a user of Microsoft Teams, Teams has the meeting function. And then it also has the asynchronous function, which is very similar to Slack. If you've never seen these, I'm going to give you a couple screenshots in a minute. And I really think that a majority of teamwork can be done using these tools. Now, you might be saying, geez, we don't use these tools. Well, I think now is a good time to begin to get into to using them. But I know that having people switch tool sets in the middle of a situation like this is difficult. So you might want to think about it more as a long-term play. There's a few other platforms worth knowing. For any sort of brainstorming, I really like Trello. It's basically like virtual Post-it notes. Mural and Miro are virtual whiteboard solutions. But I want to talk about brainstorming just for a minute. I'm sorry, I'm also going to reference Wharton in this reference as well. Wharton School of Business did a study a while back on brainstorming techniques. And in one situation, they brought everybody into a room and they said, okay, everyone, we need new ideas around this topic. And everybody sat there and they talked and they generated new ideas. Then in the other experiment, or the A/B testing, this was like the B, they said to the group, everybody come up with ideas on your own, and then we'll get in the room and discuss them. Well, that second process was far more effective. They said it was 2 to 3 times more effective, not only in terms of the number of ideas, but the quality of ideas. Because once again, being told, come up with new ideas, like right now, is tough. But if you have a chance to think about it on your time, Maybe it's, after lunch when you want to clear your head, or maybe it's while you're walking the dog or whatever, you'll get better results. So even with brainstorming, I think this synchronous versus asynchronous framework is really, really helpful. And when you can, push it towards asynchronous. As far as tool sets, it's easier to expand the use of a current tool than adopt a new one. So if you're using Slack as an example just for messaging and you've never used it to run a project, go watch a tutorial. I mean, it's something that you might have to learn first and slowly help other people to get. But boy, powerful. If you're going to go adopt a brand new tool, I feel compelled to say, yes, check in with your IT people if you've got IT people, or at least somebody maybe who's techy around, hey, can we trust this? There's been a variety of concerns around putting certain types of confidential information into cloud-based platforms, particularly those that are called premium, meaning initially they're free. So like Trello is free. I had Herman Miller's IT security check it out. They said, cool, use it. That was several years ago, and I'm still using it. And when it comes to using tools, if you want to know how to help people adopt new technology tools, ask them to play. Don't tell them to go use it. I worked for a different furniture manufacturer years ago when we got our first BlackBerrys. I was in Chicago, and I'll never forget that we had a trainer who scheduled time on our calendar every third day during the first couple of weeks when we got our BlackBerrys. It was an hour. Play with your BlackBerry. There's a logic there, because if we're building something in one of these tools and I don't know how to use the tool and I go and I try it, I might screw something up. But if you're telling me to play, or if you're even giving me a place to play, then I can goof around. I can try a few things. If I delete something, nobody's going to be like, what'd you do? And so if you're concerned, if we go back to the questions, that you guys are on meetings all day long and you think, okay, let's use Basecamp or let's use the function in Teams or something to go try to communicate differently, I really suggest that you actually create a little playground and show people what this might look like. And that's what I do actually at Herman Miller. So I work remotely a lot. A lot of my colleagues don't. I've had to work with many of them on trying to get up to speed on Teams, which is our primary platform, over the last several years. Well, specifically that one over the last year. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give you an example. This is a screenshot. This is always dangerous when you take a screenshot of your actual computer into a presentation. This is a screenshot of Microsoft Teams, if you've never seen this before. So this is not the meeting function. This is the asynchronous collaboration function. I created a fake project, Project Blackbriar. If anybody knows the reference to Blackbriar, I feel like I should have a prize for you, but you can put it in the chat function. That's from one of my favorite movies. I'll tell you later. So I created this fake project. And I kind of, in this case, pretended like it was more of a customer interaction, like a sales interaction or something like that. And you can see on the left, Project Blackbriar, that's the project. Underneath it, there's a general channel. These are called channels or individual conversations. Think about them that way. And on the right, you see we're in the general channel, and I posted a welcome message. Hey, everyone, welcome to Project Blackbriar Team site. You'll see individual channels on the left dedicated to the following topics. And you can use the files, which is up top, and wiki tabs for storing content. So your project files actually can live right within here, or in Slack or other programs as well, which is amazing. And then I explain, here's what you do with these channels on the left. Team communication, updates, customer interaction. If anybody talks with our customer, please let everybody else know, so we know that the conversation's been had. Pricing estimates, it could be anything based on what you're doing. But because this is fake, what I can do is say, hey, please go goof around. Post a GIF or post an update or upload a document or whatever. And everyone knows, like, it's not real. And so if they screw it up, it's no big deal. But pretty soon, it's kind of amazing. Usually after like maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, people are like, okay, I get it. And then I bring them into a real team. And what's interesting about any asynchronous collaboration platform is that if you add somebody into a team or into a Slack channel or into Basecamp, they can go back and they can look at months worth of content there and completely get caught up. It's very different than using email as an example. So that's Teams. If we go to the next slide, this is not a screenshot of my computer, just a general screenshot that I lifted from the web. But this is Slack. If you've never seen Slack before, it has a very similar structure where there's individual channels on the left. By the way, I didn't say this before, but you can one-on-one message with people. Each of these platforms has the ability to call somebody over your computer and interact synchronously if you want to. Slack is a little, it takes maybe just a little bit more getting used to, but it has some really powerful features because it has so many integrations with so many other products, like in this case, the Google Suite. So if you use the Google Suite, and you create a Google Doc and you post it in Slack, it has the ability to say, hey, thanks for sharing. There's 2 or 3 people on this channel that don't have access to this document. Would you like to give it to them? And write in Slack and say yes. Oh, seamless. I love it. Okay, next slide is Trello. This is tough. This is a tough one because it's such an interactive platform to share with a screenshot. But basically, Trello, as I mentioned, is like virtual Post-it notes. And in this case, they have a template for Remote Team Hub. So if you want to go play with this, you can. But basically, there's these column headers, which you can make whatever you want. Team info, current projects, completed projects, could be work in process, could be parking lot. You know how you do the parking lot on the side of the whiteboard. And then every one of these things underneath is a card. Now I can't click on it because this is just a static screenshot, but basically you click on any of these and behind it, there's things like checklists or assignments or to-do dates or whatever. You can add an image like the one on the left. And then what's really cool is anybody can get in here and start dragging these things around. So, okay, team, it's from work in process to completed. And then when everybody goes there, they can see it. I love Trello for this sort of to-do list. There's actually a Trello integration with both Teams and Slack. I'm getting super down the tech path for you, but you can actually use it right within Teams. So cool. Awesome. So that kind of covers off on the tech platforms, but I am happy to talk about more of these. And yes, Dan, it was a Jason Bourne reference, Blackbriar, one of the greatest movie series of all time. I can talk about it for a while, but that's not why you tuned in. Okay, let's move on from tech tools. Professional video interactions. I was tempted to put the picture of the dude from the Skype call on the left, but instead I put a picture, a stock image of a guy staring at his laptop, and I'm sure he's working hard, but this would be a bad situation for video because he's doing a few things that I wouldn't recommend. So let me go through each of these. There's probably a recording of our happy hour a few weeks ago if you really want to get into depth on this, or I can spend more time on this during the Q&A time. But my first principle is this. If you're in an environment where there's a lot of stuff going on, you're going to feel better if the chaos is in front of you, not behind you. So if you've got, if you're working at the kitchen table and the kitchen table is next to a wall, have that laptop on the kitchen table be pointed at you and you be sitting in front of the wall. Or if you've got a desk pushed up against a wall and your camera is pointing back into the room, think about pulling that desk out and putting you with your back against the wall like I'm doing. If this is a challenge for you. For me, it is. I mean, I've got 3 kids, my wife, dog in the house, and they've got their own stuff going on. And it's not that they're disrespectful at all, but sometimes, sometimes they have a 10-year-old come in here and ask you to help with math. And I need to be able to kind of give him a little nod like, hey, not right now, in a little while. Or if you're in an apartment where you don't have a dedicated home office, or you're in a home without a home office and you're doing this stuff in the living room, personally, I feel it's so much more of a relief to know that whatever is going on in front of me. And then if I need to step away, it's not weird for me to step away for a moment, as if I'm getting coffee or using the restroom or something, but I might be telling someone, hey, can you give me 15 minutes? Or if you've got young kids, it's a whole separate set of challenges. I do believe, though, and there's some good evidence to suggest that you shouldn't totally hide what's going on in your world from the people that you're talking to. So I had a dog barking. I acknowledged it. I told you his name was Griffin. He's named after the Griffins, and that he's a yippy barky dog. And hopefully that creates a little bit of empathy where you're like, okay, I understand this dude a little bit better and what he's facing. I've heard of some amazing and hilarious stories of young kids busting into meetings in recent weeks. My own coworkers, I really encourage them. Like, show me your dog. Or if your kid comes over, like, let me wave. Hello. I think there's something important there. Even when you're dealing with a customer or a board of directors or an external stakeholder or your boss or whatever, just opening up ourselves to the humanity of it all is not a bad thing. Eye contact. If you use video, the whole idea here is that we're making eye contact, right? If your laptop is way down low, it's tough to do that. So if you're going to be on video for a particularly important meeting, try to get that camera up. I'm fortunate to have a Herman Miller sit-stand desk, so I literally can take this thing all over. Every once in a while, by the way, I'll move from sitting to stand during a meeting, which I know throws people off, like what's going on over there. But for me, I'm trying to get the right sight lines, and I want to be comfortable. If you don't have that, cardboard box, books, whatever, about 10 inches off your desk, going to get that camera up, and people aren't going to be looking at your chin or up your nose. There's a reason why people take selfies like this, like slightly above their eye level, because it's more flattering versus nobody takes selfies from desktop level. It's just not a flattering way of being. And this is not about like shallow aesthetics. It's more about just feeling comfortable, feeling the best, particularly if you got to sit here and look at yourself while you're on video. Bright lighting, ideally in front of you, not behind you. If you sit in front of a window where the window is behind you, it's going to completely wash you out. Like you will turn dark. The camera will blacken the foreground where you are and focus on that bright light, and you're going to look like you're a witness protection program. So it's just a matter of rotating around to try to get those windows in front of you if you can. I am a fan, if it's really critical, of actually rehearsing video calls. Like I deal with, I shouldn't say I deal with, I have the privilege of supporting our amazing sales teams a lot with customers. And in fact, I've got one today with a large organization in California. If it's an important call and we're going to be discussing something critical, I will kind of force people to say, we're going to have a quick run through. Even this webinar this morning, like the team, we hopped on at 9:40 or whatever it was, just to make sure that we knew what we're doing. I think it's a really smart thing to do. Now, again, I said, don't overschedule people on video. So I'm assuming here that there's like a certain judiciousness in saying, does it need to be on video or doesn't it? I was also sharing with the West Coast Chamber team just a study I was learning about this morning, indicating that in some cases, people could read each other's emotions through audio better than through audio and video. It's non-conclusive, but I do think there's a certain logic in that. We are more attentive to listening to people's vocal inflections when we're not necessarily staring. So use your best judgment in terms of when video is right or when it isn't, particularly if it's like a high stakes call. And as I've mentioned before, be mindful of nonverbal communication. In this case, if you're on like a group call and it's an important one, and one of your coworkers is saying something and you momentarily roll your eyes or furrow your brow or whatever, they can see that. So we all need to be mindful of the fact that we're visible, which is one of the reasons it's so darn tiring to be on video so much. Oops, I just tried to advance the slide. Could you go to the next slide for me, please? Let's talk about process effectiveness. Role clarity, so important. We use RACI, which is a model for responsibilities. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. It's just a way of saying, like, whose job is it to do this? And whose job is it to make sure that they stay on track? Who's consulted and who's just in the loop? Around Herman Miller specifically, it's a very collaborative but very democratized kind of culture. We struggle with this normally. That's why we use RACI. Sometimes we actually have to say who is responsible for getting this done, because otherwise we'll just happily live in collaborative bliss and assume that somebody's doing it. So role clarity when you're working virtual is even more important because you don't really know. You don't really know what's going on, so it's important to communicate that. I suggest breaking processes down into very achievable steps for the first several weeks of a project for sure. As I mentioned at the beginning of our call, you ideally want people to feel like they're having early success. And so even if it means that you've done whatever this project is 100 times and you normally would expect to be much farther, think about packing off just for the first few weeks. Help the people to get into the groove. Determine a clear, visible place to manage progress. Whatever that is, maybe it's Trello, maybe it's Basecamp, maybe it's something else. Just everyone should know where to look. So that if you go, oh, wait, and I do this all the time, by the way, because I am not a process person. I'll be sitting there going, wait, weren't we supposed to have a meeting with so-and-so? I just did this yesterday, in fact. I shot a Slack note to one of my external collaborators. Weren't we supposed to talk with so-and-so? Later, of course, I realized it's on the calendar for 11 o'clock after this call because I didn't look. had I looked. We actually do have a place where we manage this. I just didn't look. I shut off the note before I looked. So having that destination where everybody can go, okay, what's falling through the cracks is really important. Gut checks. I recommend, I know it's a simple thing, but I really recommend everybody do this over the lunch hour. I do. My gut check is, in terms of a project, who isn't being heard? Are the introverts getting completely run over? Who might be experiencing burnout? Who might be struggling? Who might be, we ask somebody to do something, but I'm not totally sure they're equipped to do it. The other thing I do is my own mental and emotional health, which I said early on, I work remotely a lot, but I got to tell you, I have had major cognitive overload the last couple of weeks. In fact, I'll share with you, I was on a different webinar last Tuesday. I had been on video all day Monday and Monday night for 2 hours Monday night. And I don't know what email I read before getting onto this webinar, but it was one that had like a deadline. I was somewhere in the midst of talking and my brain just checked out. Like I was like, what am I saying again? I'm sure it looked at the people like I didn't know what I was doing. I just hit cognitive overload. Sometimes your brain just will tell you when to stop. The stress will come out one way or the other. So I increasingly am just checking in with myself and going, geez, how am I doing? I'll go outside. Now that the weather's nicer, I'm looking out the window here. It is just so nice to take a breather, go outside, enjoy a cup of tea, whatever it takes for you, because these are high stress times. Finally, before we get into additional Q&A, take the long view. What are you doing now that might be really, really positive for you and your team over time, right? So what competencies are you learning? What muscles are you building that allow you to get farther? And celebrate the small things. You know, it might sound silly to say, hey, we got our project on Slack for the first time. Yay! But it creates a certain sense of positivity and optimism that I think is really, really important. I am a techno-optimist, as they say, and I had the privilege of knowing some of the editorial staff at Fortune, actually, and I just said this to the digital editor at Fortune earlier this week. I believe there will be such positive effects in terms of long-term flexible working from this short-term, hopefully short-term, duress and challenge that we're all feeling. If people decide to make what they're doing purposeful. If we say, all right, this is not fun, but we're going to make it work and we're going to learn some new tricks and we're going to get better, I think this might be a real blessing in disguise. If it's, I'm just enduring this and I can't wait to get back into the office, it might be a while, friends. You know, we are in touch with some of the best thinkers in the world around return to workplace sort of scenarios. You probably have seen Microsoft and Google have already said everyone's working from home for the rest of the year, the calendar year. I don't think it'll be that way for everyone, but it is very likely that we will see a hybridization of what we've got now versus what we once had, where people still come into the office, but it's more sparsely populated, and there's always a contingent working remotely. And so everything we're talking about now, I think it'll benefit you long term. For me, it has transformed the way I work. I actually left Herman Miller for a while to go work for a software company that I really loved, and then I came back. And one of the things I said is, hey, I don't tend to be in the office more than a day or two a week. Is that cool with you? And thankfully, Herman Miller is really great about that stuff. But for me, I just felt like I learned a better way of working. I was completely remote for that software company. I was 100% like this, except not with all the personal chaos. And so I'll stop beating this horse, but let's make this purposeful and work for us. All right, time check, 10:40, perfect. Q&A. First, I'm just going to quick look at the chat function. Robin says she's familiar with cognitive overload. Yes, so the fresh air is really important. There's actually a school of interior design thinking called biophilic design, came out of Harvard, that suggests that the organic elements that we see outside should be brought inside. I won't get into the whole interior design aspect of it, but the whole thing is rooted in just how unbelievably beneficial it is for us to get more natural light, to see some greenery, to smell the fresh air. I did write a little article for LinkedIn last week on the benefits of working outdoors. I work probably 30 to 60 minutes a day outdoors when I can, right? So not when it's raining or sleeting or scorching. So roughly 4 days a year. I'm kidding. But I think it's super beneficial. I personally like to do it earlier in the day, and it's where I go do my emails. Like I do emails outdoors. I have a little patio umbrella. The glare can be a challenge later in the day, so I go out there, and I find that it's a game changer. So I totally encourage that. Okay, so let me just go back. And then, by the way, if you have additional questions, enter them into the chat function, or Britt and team, I don't know if we're going to do any sort of live Q&A, but let me just go back and double check, or maybe you all can help me double check if there's anything I missed in terms of these questions. Marianne asked about a good project plan online tool. In terms of project planning, I have friends that use Monday.com. I never have. Basecamp has been successful for us, but increasingly we're using Trello, which is a really simple tool. But I think we've found that the project managers, the people that really, really can be mindful of time, people, resources, they've got their own Gantt chart somewhere. And they make it a little bit simpler for those of us like me that are not particularly process oriented. But I think if you looked across Herman Miller, Basecamp, Asana, what else? Platforms like that would probably be the most popular.
Hey, Ryan, with those platforms, do you feel like it's best to just streamline and all use one? Or if people have individual preferences, you know, if some really like Teams and others like to jump on a Zoom call, how do you manage that when there are some personal preference differences within one team?
Oh, great question. And I will, yeah, that is a great question. You need to standardize. You need as a team to say, this is what we're using. I mentioned that I use Teams and I use Slack. The only reason why I use both is because I have a group of digital service providers around the world who use Slack on their own, and they're so proficient with it that I spend some time there. But most of what I use is Teams. And as a company, by the way, Herman Miller is moving exclusively to Teams. We're phasing out Slack. You need to pick one. Having multiple disparate tool sets is so confusing. There was a belief years ago that all of our technology ecosystems would become unified. In fact, we were talking about RingCentral earlier. They probably would have described themselves as a unified communications platform, meaning they do your desk phones and they do video, et cetera. The reality is very little has been unified. Instead, there's a trend in the tech world known as consumerization, which basically talks about the effects of consumer-originated technologies on the way we work. In the last 10 years, you can go create a software platform, get it in the cloud, let anybody adopt it, and have it be the simplest, most intuitive thing you've ever used. And as a result, oh my gosh, there's so many options. And the older school technologies, you know, anything that has a remote control with like 40 buttons compared to an app that has 2, I have really, really struggled. But the byproduct has been that there's way too many tools in use. So somebody needs to make the call. At an enterprise level, you really should try to determine, hey, this is what we're going to use. But it can happen at a team level as well. It definitely does not work for people to be communicating in 2 separately totally different systems.
Yep, that totally makes sense. Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. We are close to wrapping up our time here. So if we could finish up with what would your top takeaway that you would like everyone to leave with today? There's so much good information here, but if you left us with one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would highlight some of the key parts, which is if you're in the midst of working remotely and it feels like things are a little bit off, you need to zoom back out and say, we need to look at the overall process and try to look at redesigning how we get from point A to point B, and have every group member feel super empowered to say what is or isn't working, and have it be a long-term focus so that you can really figure out as an organization how to do that. I also see that we've had at least one other question. I'm happy to answer that via email. If I can't remember what time we were scheduled for, whether it was 10:45 or 11, but if there's other questions, I'm happy to take them. Ryan_Anderson@hermanmiller.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I did put a fair amount of content related to what we're talking about today out on LinkedIn in some of those articles as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. This was a lot of fun and so many good takeaways that we can all bring back. So we really appreciate you joining us today. All
yeah,
right,
thanks,
everyone.
friends. Be
Yes.
well.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for joining us. We will have a recording of this presentation available on our website later. We are also all about feedback at the Chamber. So be sure to fill out our survey and provide feedback on today's virtual program, in addition to other topic ideas that you might have for us. Also, taking a look at the week ahead, we have some other great programs coming up. Tomorrow will be a retail restart webinar. And then on Friday morning, we'll be doing a payroll protection program update. So lots of great stuff coming up. Feel free to access our COVID-19 toolkit on our website. Lots of other good information there at westcoastchamber.org. And with that, have a remarkable day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.